You guys absolutely loved the first rendition of this video, so as promised, we're back at it again. Let's hop back in the time machine, revisit and regrade some of the biggest trades in NFL history. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you check out part 1 first. It's a banger, I promise. Oh, and by the way, I checked the analytics and a very small amount of you who watch my videos are subscribed, so if you're not and you enjoy this video, feel free to hit that sub button. It's free. Anyways, that's enough self-promoting. Let's go. I sort of weaseled out of talking about this trade in the first video since it's reached the echelon of NFL folklore and pretty much everyone knows about it, but I literally talked about DeAndre Hopkins and Deshaun Watson last time, so whatever. Herschel Walker to Minnesota. For those of you who don't know, in 1989, the Dallas Cowboys were in the worst state in the history of the franchise. Jerry Jones bought the team and completely ran the old guard out of town, leaving them with one of the worst teams in NFL history and Herschel Walker. Walker is literally just the Bugatti meme in this scenario. The Minnesota Vikings were perennial playoff runner-ups throughout the 1980s and felt like they were a strong run game away from being able to hoist the Lombardi Trophy. With Dallas ready to move off of Walker so they could truly begin their rebuild, Minnesota proceeded to ship off the franchise's entire future to acquire him. In exchange, the Cowboys got 3 draft picks and 4 players. However, there's a catch. Jimmy Johnson had no interest in the players he got in the trade. By cutting them all, he acquired even more compensatory picks. When it was all said and done, the Cowboys ended up with 3 firsts, 3 seconds, a third, and a 6th. The trade resulted in like 10,000 other trades that ultimately netted them several quality NFL starters, with the headliners being Darren Woodson and some guy named Emmitt Smith. Something tells me you may have heard of him before. Thanks in part to those guys, the Cowboys catapulted from being the NFL's doormat to winning 3 Super Bowls in 5 years, and single-handedly being the springboard to the massive ego possessed by many of their fans. The Vikings, on the other hand, when they acquired Herschel Walker, saw more immediate dividends.
A moment of indecision. He did so last week in a Cowboy uniform. Here's the carry.
And that's it. Walker's time in purple is laughably underwhelming, failing to crack 1,000 yards in 2 seasons as the Vikings transformed from being playoff jobbers to being even bigger playoff jobbers. There's a reason people call this transaction the trade, folks. While Herschel Walker was in the slums of mediocrity with the Vikings, the Atlanta Falcons were rotting in the basement throughout much of the 80s. They hadn't made the postseason since 1982, and a 3-13 1989 got both their head coach fired and the first overall pick. The consensus first pick was Illinois' Jeff George, the 6'4" quarterback that was projected to be the NFL's next franchise savior. However, the Falcons weren't particularly interested, so they shipped the pick off to the Indianapolis Colts, who selected the local kid number 1. In exchange, the Colts coughed up wide receiver Andre Rison, offensive tackle Chris Hinton, a 5th-round pick in that year's draft, and a 1st-round pick in next year's draft. Atlanta spent that 1st-rounder on wide receiver Mike Pritchard. Partially in thanks to these guys, the Falcons were able to return to relevance in 1991, going 10-6 and winning a playoff game against their despised division rivals. The 91 Falcons were an awesome team, but they fell back to earth pretty quickly after that, and both Rison and Hinton were gone by the end of the 94 season. Good trade, but could have been way better. The Colts, on the other hand, enjoyed little to no success in their 4 years with George. He was an excellent talent with a huge attitude problem that lingered for his entire career, and he threw more picks than touchdowns with Indianapolis. After the 93 season, the Colts had seen enough and they decided to ship him off. They were somehow able to net 2 first-round picks in the deal too. The team that decided that the disgruntled quarterback was the missing piece? None other than the Falcons.
What?
Now, to be fair, George was definitely better in Atlanta, but not to the degree that justifies trading multiple first-rounders. They did sneak into the playoffs in 1995, courtesy of their backup quarterback, only for George to be brought back when the playoffs started, and for him and the team to be decimated by the man the Falcons once had, but they just had to screw that up too. Meanwhile, what did the Colts do with their newfound fortune? They traded the 1994 first-round pick to San Francisco, who they used on Hall of Famer Bryant Young. Okay, seriously, no one has been able to do anything right in this entire Jeff George mess. Somebody throw me a lifeboat, please.
With the 19th choice in the first round, the Indianapolis Colts select Marvin Harrison, wide receiver from Syracuse.
Okay, that helps. I refuse to give the Colts an A+ since they basically traded Bryant Young for a linebacker that only lasted 3 years in the league, but getting one of the best receivers in NFL history definitely softens the blow, like, a lot. Let me shift gears to the guy I hinted at in the last video, Champ Bailey. When the Washington Redskins acquired New Orleans' entire 1999 draft, they used some of those picks to trade back up and acquire the Georgia corner. He was outstanding in DC, but your typical contract drama shenanigans meant that he was going to be on the move. You would think Washington would want to ship him off for a truckload of draft picks and reload the roster that way, but instead they opted to get another player allegedly of his caliber. Out went Bailey, in came running back Clinton Portis. Yes, a running back. Let's just say the stigma around the position isn't exactly what it was 20 years ago. Champ Bailey continued to be a franchise piece at corner well into his 30s in Denver, raking in Pro Bowl appearances and flirting with the DPOY at one point. He's one of the greatest cornerbacks of all time, and he now has a bust in Canton. Portis remained good as a Redskin, getting 4 1,000-yard campaigns out of him, although the comical 5.5 yards per carry he had in Denver was something he couldn't quite replicate. So when you look at it that way, Washington got a great player, Denver got an all-timer. I suppose it's a win-win with Denver getting the slight upper hand.
But wait, there's more.
Oh, by the way, did I mention that Washington also gave Denver a second-round pick in the trade too? The Broncos turned that pick into Portis' replacement in running back Tatum Bell, who had 2 decent years but was out of the NFL after 2008. Real quick, let's just do that. Alright, fix. Breeze's devastating shoulder injury in 2005 resulted in San Diego deciding that it was Rivers' time to shine. And this is the part where I remind you that the Chargers could have just rocked with Drew Brees and drafted Pitt wide receiver Larry Fitzgerald instead, but I digress. Eli took over Saints to bring in Archie Manning for 2 firsts and 2 seconds. Bill Tobin, he of Mel Kiper doesn't know any more than my Postman fame, flew down to Atlanta to watch the Saints play the Falcons with the plan of confirming the trade after the game was over. The Saints, however, had just benched Archie. Their plan was to let backup Bobby Scott take over in anticipation of trading Manning. However, Scott got injured in the game, the third stringer was a disaster, and next thing you know, New Orleans called the deal off. So, change of plans. The Los Angeles Rams caught wind of Devine being desperate for a QB, so they called him and offered veteran John Hadl, a once superstar passer in the AFL who was 34 years old and just played one of the worst games of his life against these very Packers barely a week ago. Devine, without telling Green Bay's executive committee, green-lighted the trade. John Hadl for 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and a 3rd-round pick. Predictably, the trade blew up in Green Bay's face pretty quickly. Hadl only played 19 games as a Packer, throwing 9 touchdowns to 29 picks while completing less than half his passes. Those are terrible numbers even in the 1970s. After the 74 season, Dan Devine, sensing his days were numbered, fled for Notre Dame. The Rams used the picks they got to build their secondary and offensive line, and although they didn't get any superstars, they were able to keep their contending window open throughout the 70s, even reaching a Super Bowl in 1979. Let's wrap this video up with a trade that got a handful of requests in the previous video. Matthew Stafford to the Rams. It's probably now thought of as the Stafford for Goff trade, but all that does is show how much the perception of Jared Goff has changed. If you polled 100 Lions fans if Goff was the franchise guy or just a placeholder, you probably would have gotten 100 latter answers and a couple pairs of rolling eyes. The Lions wanted to rebuild, and Matthew Stafford wanted the opportunity to win for once. The Rams had some picks they didn't want and a quarterback they didn't want, so they pulled the trigger. With that trade in the books, the Lions immediately revved up the tanks for the 2021 season and became, quote, the best 0-8 team of all time. The Rams took their new signal caller, and in his first season playing for a franchise other than Detroit, immediately won his first Super Bowl. Obviously, Stafford wasn't the only reason why they did it, but nonetheless, the Rams were popping champagne and the Lions were doing just your average Lion stuff. All was normal. Then 2022 happened. The Rams came flying out the gates and got punched in the face by the Bills in front of their home crowd. They hung around 500 for around half the season, but Stafford was plagued by injuries, and the Rams only won 2 of their final 11 games. Did I mention the Lions had their first-round pick? Speaking of the Lions, how are they doing?
And Goff is looking to throw, and he throws it. It's caught for the first down by DJ.
How the turntables.
Courtesy of the assets they got from the Rams, the Lions went and added Jamison Williams, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Sam Laporta. Oh, by the way, Jared Goff's really good now. On top of Goff's development, the Lions have done an amazing job of surrounding him with talent. It all came to a head this past season when Detroit won their first division title in 30 years and ran into none other than Matthew Stafford and the Rams in the first round of the playoffs. Both quarterbacks thrived in the game, but as I'm sure you all know, Detroit made the plays Los Angeles didn't and finally exercised their playoff demons. The Lions' run eventually came to an end in the NFC Championship game, and now for the first time since Eisenhower was in office, the organization commands respect from the rest of the league. This trade is obviously a win-win, but as of right now, I have to give the slightly greener checkmark to the Rams. Just like I said when talking about the Eli trade, one of them's got a ring and one of them doesn't. We'll come back to this trade if the Lions can close the deal in the near future. And that'll do it for the trade sequel video. As always, thank you very much for letting me be a part of your day, and feel free to like and hit that big red subscribe button if you enjoyed. Have a blessed day, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace!